It felt like just yesterday we were, doing hypotheticals for this map, and now here we are. So this is the second to last map you're going to see from me prior to the 2024 presidential election, predicting the Electoral College. Let's get into it. As we always do, we're going to begin by filling out our states that are going to be safe for Kamala Harris. And what you'll notice is that none of these have changed since the previous edition of this video. Again, the only, thing to note here is that I am going to be putting, right, like states North P, as well as Illinois, in the safe column for her, just because I don't really think they're worth talking about. Even if Trump does narrow up the margins a little bit, it's not really going to be relevant to the election. Whereas for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they're going to start out with the same number of safe states that they would normally be getting. So for them, that's going to be, I believe, 107 electoral votes. South Carolina, of course. So with that being said, we now have, kind of some states to focus on. Let's talk about them. We'll start out with our likely Democratic states. And Colorado was safe. I forgot that. I knew it was missing one. So our first, just to kind of get these out in kind of a batch here, New Mexico, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Maine, I think, are all kind of in the same boat here. And again, these are states that I'd be very shocked if Kamala Harris lost or even came close to losing. Again, Minnesota is the state that Tim Walz comes from. Harris is up by 8 to 10 points in most polling here. New Mexico is similar. The limited polling we have shows her ahead. New Hampshire, obviously, is a left-trending, educated state in New England, where the polls, we've gotten more polling here, so I'll actually pull it up here. But again, the polling has been very good for Harris there. She's up by 7, and Biden did well there in 2020. So these are all states I don't really think are too disputable. Now, there's two more that I want to talk about, which are Nebraska's 2nd District and Virginia. So, Nebraska's 2nd District was initially thought to be competitive, but we've gotten a slew of terrible polling there for Donald Trump. I mean, if I just pull this up right here, Nebraska District 2, here we go. They don't have an average, but Harris has led by at minimum 5 in every poll, right? And the only poll that had Trump competitive here was one from July before Biden dropped out of the race, and it was from a Republican internal that had it tied. The nonpartisan, more recent polls, Survey USA, they have Harris up by 5. She's up by 11 in CNN, and then in the NYT likely voter undecided push, they had Harris up by 9. So I don't think this one's going to be close. I think she'll win it by 6, 7 maybe, points. Now, Virginia is probably the closest of these light blue, of these likely Democratic states, but I still am inclined to believe that it's going to be pretty solid for Kamala Harris. A lot of people have really bought into the Virginia hype. I'm going to be contrary, and I'm just going to say Virginia is going to stay about what it was in 2020 as of right now. Again, if before Election Day we get some indication it's actually going to be close, I'll revise that in the final video. But the better polls here, right, like the Watson Center, was very good in 2020. They have Harris up by 11, which is more than Biden won it by. And then Emerson has Harris up by 7, but Emerson's been pretty bearish on Democrats the past 2 cycles. And I'm not saying I don't think 7 points is an unreasonable guess, but the fact that we haven't really gotten like a super close nonpartisan poll to me suggests that, yeah, we're likely to see Virginia stay with Kamala Harris likely by a similar amount to Joe Biden. Or Joe Biden from 2020, I should clarify. So with that, let's get into our likely Trump states. So again, there's just kind of to, get these out of the way. I think there's a few that aren't really worth talking too much about, which are going to be Alaska, Kansas, and Iowa. Now, Alaska, actually, I lied. I will talk about Alaska a little bit. Alaska is interesting because Alaska is very left trending, and this gets more apparent kind of every election. But Biden did 5 points better than Hillary Clinton here in 2020, and Harris has gotten some, okay polling data. Again, Alaska Survey Research. They had Harris up or only down by 5. And again, Trump's lead expands tonight when you push undecided, so, say what you will. But again, the GOP internals here, right? They've actually showed that this race isn't likely to be better for Trump than it was last time. Again, the Nick Begich, who's a, GOP candidate for Congress, they have Trump only up by 10 there, which is the amount he won it by in 2020. So that leads me to believe he'll win it by maybe 7 or 8, a bit less than 2020, be my guess. But for now, I would put it in the likely Republican column. Now, Kansas is similar. It's left trending, but it starts out as a lot redder, so I think both states could swing 2 to 3 points to the left, maybe Alaska more so than Kansas. Kansas, if I had to predict, I'll release the final margins the day before the election, but I think he'll win Kansas by 13 or something like that. Then Iowa, which is right trending, Trump won it by 8 in 2020. Yeah, the SIR poll only had him up by 6, which wasn't a great sign for him. But I do expect SIR's polls tend to actually swing right in the final poll. When we get that October SIR poll, That will literally be my prediction in all likelihood. I think they're going to have Trump up by something like 9 or 10. I think that's what's going to happen at the end of the day. Now, there are, again, some more states I want to talk about here. Maine's 2nd District and Ohio, which, by the way, I'm referring to the districts as states because in the Electoral College, they vote this, they vote the same way. But, just for anyone who's upset by that, my apologies. Now, Maine's 2nd District is interesting because we got a poll over the summer that actually showed Kamala Harris up, and not by an insignificant amount. She was ahead by a margin of 5% in one, I believe, UNH poll. Let's see, I think it was UNH. Yeah, it was a UNH survey. They pushed undecideds. They had Harris up by 5. Now, that's an outlier because, again, the other polling we've gotten, like the previous UNH poll, had Trump up by 2, and then Pan Atlantic had Trump up by 7, which I think is a very fair, margin there. And obviously the Harris +5 poll is interesting, but it doesn't really give me a lot of pause just because, again, when we talk about polling misses in America, they don't repeat themselves, but they do often rhyme. And again, in 2016 and 2020, to an extent in 2018 as well, the states where the biggest pro-GOP polling miss occurred, the districts where the biggest pro-GOP polling miss occurred, were the districts that were mostly working class, not super educated, and most importantly, were already right trending, and Maine's 2nd District fits that like a glove. It's right trending, it's rural, you have a lot of working class voters, and again, this is a seat that voted for Barack Obama twice. It voted for Al Gore and John Kerry. Then, when Trump was on the ballot, it just zoomed 15, 20 points to the right. I don't feel comfortable putting it in the competitive column. Trump's going to win it by, I think, 6, 7, 8 points, and Democrats are likely, going to be in a very tough race to hold on to their congressional seat there concurrently, and I'll be getting to that in my next House video. Now, Ohio is similar. Ohio is a right-running state. It's a state where you do see a lot of, a big share of the electorate is like comprised of like white working class voters who don't have college degrees, who have been trending right, maybe voted for Obama, didn't vote for Clinton or Biden, and are not going to vote for Harris in all likelihood this time. And so that makes me, again, believe Trump's on track to win Ohio more than he did in either 2016 or 2020. I know a lot of people don't share that opinion with me, but he's up by 8 points, and, realistically, I do think that the polling miss is going to be a lot less pronounced in 2024 than it was in 2020 or 2016, just because if you look at the polls, I think that's pretty apparent. But at the same time, Ohio in 2022 was the Senate race with the smallest pro-Democratic polling miss. I think that's going to translate to an extent because the polls haven't really changed that much since 2022. And again, Ohio, I'm going to put it in the GOP column. Trump's going to win it by 9 or 10 if I had to guess. Now, with that being said, I think this is the, again, same map of states that we're going to be talking about. Now, there is one state that I'm going to single out here, and usually it would be Texas, and we'll get to Texas later in the video. It's going to be Florida. So Florida's going to be in the likely column, but I actually think it's a lot lower down than Ohio or Iowa or Kansas, for example. So this state, I think all the hype for Harris kind of ended when we got a Trump +13 bomb out of the New York Times. I don't think he'll win Florida by 13. I think he might win it by half of that. But again, what we've been seeing is that a lot of pollsters outside of the New York Times have been showing a close race, and these are good pollsters. Marist is a poll I really like. They only have Trump up by 4. Redfield only had Trump up by 4. RMG, which is a GOP-aligned, used to be a GOP-aligned poll, I think they're actually pretty good now. They only had Trump up by 2. So again, we've seen a lot of like actual polling indicators that Harris could be competitive here. I don't buy it. Again, Florida's a right-trending state. You have a lot of Hispanic voters maybe who aren't responding to polls who are likely to swing towards Donald Trump. I also think there's an underrated factor of Florida kind of, starting to really solidify its identity as a GOP state. I think you have a lot of Republicans moving there, and they likely have moved there since 2020 or since COVID. You've also maybe had a lot of Democrats moving out because they don't like the policy direction of the state. That's going to make it redder just in terms of the electorate. I think the rest of it comes down to just how well Harris does in Miami-Dade County, which is the largest county in the state. It trended 20 points towards Trump in 2016. I don't see concrete evidence to predict it to swing all the way back, because Harris needs it to swing all the way back, really, to have a chance of winning Florida, and that's not going to happen, right? So, again, the burden is on Harris to prove, not that she needs to win Florida, but if she wanted to win Florida, I think she would need to really, first of all, lead in a nonpartisan poll, and secondly, actually find a way to convince people or to, actually gain with Hispanic voters in South Florida. I think she might do that to an extent. It won't be anywhere close enough. I'm calling it a 7-point Trump win as of right now. Now, we're going to go back to our lean Democratic states now, And I'm only going to put, actually, none are going to be put down here for the first time. We're going to have no lean Democratic states, interestingly enough. We do have a couple of lean Republican states, though. The first is going to be Texas. This one's the obvious one. I've kept, much to the chagrin of a lot of other people who comment on this channel, I've kept Texas in the lean GOP column. Now, why have I done that? It's simple. I actually think that, I'm betting on Trump doing well relative to his polls in Ohio and, in Florida as well. I think in Texas, there's an interesting case to be made for Harris outperforming her polls. And again, I know some people aren't going to like that because in 2020, the Texas polls underestimated Trump by 4 or 5 points. And again, the polls right now have Trump up by more in Texas than they do in Florida, but I don't believe that. I think Texas is going to vote to the left of Florida by a couple of points. Now, what's my reasoning for that? It's pretty simple, actually. Texas polling is a lot more checkered than Florida polling in the sense that in 2018 and 2016, we saw Democrats beat their polling in Texas, in part because you had a lot of suburban voters, right, in Dallas or Austin coming out for Beto O'Rourke in the 2018 Senate race and for Joe Biden in 2020 in the presidential election. I don't see why those voters are going to swing to Trump now. Obviously, Harris could lose the election for a number of reasons. I don't think one of them is going to be Biden 2020 suburban voters coming out for Trump. That's because, again, I think the Harris campaign has really leaned into this idea that Trump is too radical and that the GOP is too extreme. And I think it's been effective to an extent. Obviously, whether or not it's effective enough to win the presidency, we'll find out soon. But, really, the interesting thing about the Harris campaign is that it's been focused, it's been run right. We can quibble over policy, and I'm not saying this from the perspective of either someone who's voting for Harris or voting for Trump, but, I think the rhetoric used by the Harris campaign has been a lot more moderate in recent weeks than the Trump campaign. I think that was evident in the debate, where I think Harris actually tried to, really message in a way that was, could have been receptive to middle of the road voters who maybe didn't like Biden but don't like Trump, right? That kind of voter. And then I think Trump, on the other hand, really lost that debate because he didn't do the same. So that's my long way of saying that I don't think Dallas or Texas is a state that's very suburban and that Democrats rely a lot on the suburbs nowadays for keeping the margins close. And I don't think Harris is going to do poorly enough to really regress in Texas. It's also a left trending state. Biden lost it by 6. It's not crazy to think Harris loses it by 5. So those are my thoughts on Texas. Now, this is going to be a very hot take. I'm moving North Carolina into the lean Republican column now. I know a lot of people aren't going to like this, but, that's okay. I think as of right now, it's fair. I might move back before Election Day because I think North Carolina is one of the states where you do have pretty solid, benchmarks in early voting. But for now, we don't really know. We're kind of in the dark, but North Carolina, we will be for the next week or so. But based on what we know right now, I'm fairly comfortable calling Trump the favorite here. I actually made a video about this the other day, which you should go check out for a more in-depth analysis. But in short, right? The polls of North Carolina have been very stable in recent years, in the sense that they always tend to underestimate Republicans by a couple of points. Now, in the 2022 Senate race, Cheri Beasley actually beat her polls by about, I think 8% or something, relatively small like that, which was an impressive feat for a Democrat because a lot of people thought Cheri Beasley was going to lose by more than she ended up losing by. But at the same time, right, the fact that we saw in the 7 or 8 major competitive Senate races in 2022, North Carolina and Ohio stuck out as really, the polls not really missing in the favor of Democrats. Whereas the other Senate races like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, etc., the polls did really underestimate Democratic support. So that still stands out to me. But North Carolina, I also don't really think that Harris has the right, she trails in most nonpartisan polling. The only, I think nonpartisan poll she's led in recently was the High Point poll, and they pushed undecided and they get a tie, so it's kind of whatever. But to me, the interesting thing about North Carolina that I actually didn't mention a lot in the other video that I made a couple of days ago was that, or is that rather Kamala Harris, to win this state, needs something to fundamentally be different from 2020 in a way that benefits her. And I can think of a lot of reasons why Trump will do better in North Carolina than 2020, just because, maybe he'll do better with black voters by a couple of points. That's going to hurt Democrats. Maybe we'll see turnout, a Democratic turnout as a share of the electorate decrease by a couple of points. That could happen, right? And obviously, the big factor here is that it comes back to the polls. The polls are really good for Trump in North Carolina, better than they were in 2016 or 2020. I don't, see reason to call Harris the favorite in this state, and that's really what it comes down to, right? In the past, I had the state as toss Republican because we actually had some Harris polling leads for a little bit in the summer, and we also saw, maybe Democrats were hoping to get because The North Carolina Supreme Court pushed back early voting to accommodate taking RFK Jr. off the ballot. Democrats hoping to start netting votes and have, votes netted by mid-October, which we're essentially at now. That hasn't happened. I think Democrats have just had a rough couple months here. I maybe could move it back to the Harris. Like, I didn't ever have it in the Harris column for fairness in terms of being fair, but like, I could see myself calling her the favorite here on election day. Not likely. And it's going to really take a full effort by Democrats in early voting. Now, it could happen, Democrats are going to really invest here, and I think they're going to give it all they've got. So maybe Democrats are actually going to pull it off this time. But for now, I'm going to, defer to putting this in the lean Republican column. And that's going to be it for the lean Republican states. So yes, these states are all going to be toss-ups now. And I'm going to start with Michigan because I do think Harris is going to win it, but I'm moving it down from lean Democratic. I'm putting it back kind of in the toss-up-esque column. To me, tilts are toss-ups. I just like to pick winners there. And the reason for this is that we've seen actually a pretty significant narrowing of the polls. Harris was up by 3 points in mid-September. She's now up by 7. Now, obviously, we've gotten some GOP-aligned polls recently that are skewing the averages, right? Like Trafalgar and Insider Advantage. These are both polls I don't really like. But again, nonpartisan polls aren't great for Harris. Emerson had her tied here, and then the WSJ poll only had Harris up by 2. Quinnipiac, I think, was the worst for Harris that she's gotten, all summer, or, actually really since the summer where she was down by 4. Michigan, again, Quinnipiac was pretty off in Michigan in 2020. They had Biden winning by, I think 8 or 9 points, and he won it by, 3. So that's concerning for Harris. It's not like Trafalgar came out and said that it's, what Quinnipiac said. So this is the thing with Michigan. I don't think Trump's going to win it. Now, am I super confident that Harris is, the clear favorite here? No. I think a lot of people are overrating her. But at the same time, a lot of the consensus has just been that Arab voters are going to, just hand the state to Trump because of the very small, I think we have an N of 2 in terms of polling that specifically targets Arab voters in Michigan. And we have, these surveys that show pretty wild shifts in favor of Trump or really against Harris because a lot of them are voting for Jill Stein in the polls, right? And obviously that hurts Harris to an extent, but the proportion of the Michigan electorate that is Arab or just generally identifies as Islamic is very small. And so a 25-point swing with that demographic, even if you believe it, can be offset by a 1 to 2% swing in Wayne County, Detroit, right? So to me, that's not necessarily the greatest argument. If you do the math, it really doesn't. It's not that compelling. And that's why I'm going to pick Harris to win here as of right now. I could maybe put it in the Trump column, the night before the election when I do my final predictions. So stay tuned. But for now, I think the math is easier for Harris. Biden won it by 160,000 votes last time. And by the way, Detroit has actually, I believe, gained population since 2020, which is the first time it's happened in 60 years. That's going to really help Democrats. It's kind of having a mini comeback, I suppose. And that's going to help Democrats as well, just in terms of netting votes. Suburbs are trending left. Democrats did really well here in 2022. Michigan GOP hasn't won anything since 2016. I think old news. Harris, I think she'll take Michigan. Now, Pennsylvania. This is a good one because Pennsylvania, we actually have some real vote data for. And so far, Democrats are holding up well. Now, it's early, and I would because often, early vote trends aren't linear, right? But what I think we're going to see is Democrats are likely to hit their firewall. And so a good guy to follow on Twitter is Joshua Shapiro because he's a Pennsylvania guy. He is, I do believe he's a Democrat, but, he does good analysis here, right? And what we see is that Democrats in Pennsylvania have returned 285,000 votes. And again, Pennsylvania does, it registers by party. So it's pretty accurate. It's not an estimate by Target Smart. But Pennsylvania Democrats, 285K, GOP, just sort of 100K. But, it isn't the raw numbers that are shocking here because, again, in Pennsylvania, right, obviously in Pennsylvania, Democrats are more likely to request a ballot, right, because Republicans are more likely to vote on election day. This has been a thing for the past 3 elections. But the return rate is what catches my eye here. Democrats are returning their ballots at a higher rate than Republicans, and that's actually bad because usually those should be pretty even, if not a Republican lead, because the Republican voter who's asking for a ballot before to mail in or send back in, right? That type of voter is very likely to return it because the average Republican voter is just going to vote on election day. And so the fact that Republicans are going out of their way to ask for a ballot and not mail it in at the same rate as Democrats, who have a a way wider range of people requesting these ballots, that's a bad sign for them. The other interesting thing is that the firewall that Democrats are hoping for is around 500,000, and so they're already like, well, on their way there with like, again, to be fair, I should say a net firewall. CU, really, when you net it out, they're at a net of like 190,000 votes. So, they're 40% of the way there almost, and it's only been a couple days. I think they're going to get there in all likelihood. Like, the thing here is that, as is pointed out by Joshua Smithley here on Twitter, right? The return disparity in the big counties is really, really interesting here because, again, like, if you look at the counties where Democrats are outpacing Republicans by the most, just not in terms of like votes turned in, but like percentages of like who's returning their ballots the most, Democrats are crushing it in Lackawanna, Scranton, they're crushing in Philadelphia, and they're doing really well in Alag, which is where Pittsburgh is. Those are the three counties Democrats, tend to do the best in Pennsylvania in terms of votes net, right? Important. So again, that's kind of like the tangible early vote argument for Harris being favored in Pennsylvania. Again, the polling argument is also there. Like, she's polling fine here. She's up by about a point. New York Times had her up by 3, and that to me is enough to feel good about this. Again, I wouldn't move it out of the toss-up unless we get like a really good sign for Harris before Election Day because it's going to be very close. But for now, I do think she's going to win. She's likely to win, or not likely, but she's more likely to win Pennsylvania than Trump. Now, with that being said, we have to talk about some important states here. Let's go over to the state of Georgia, where Donald Trump, I believe, is the favorite. Now, again, Georgia is, I think, the best state for early voting because we know we have a very clear benchmark. It's why I've been able to call Georgia early for the past 2 elections. I'm going to, wait to make any bold predictions before early voting, which is why I'm not going to, say too much about Georgia right now. But if you made me guess, I'd still pick Trump here. He's up in the polls, and we do have some, pretty good nonpartisan pollsters, right, that show an advantage for him, right? Like Quinnipiac, again, hugely underestimated Republicans in 2020. They have Trump up by 5. And then, going over to Morning Consult, they have kind of a wash here. So the polls that are on par but have been friendlier to Democrats in recent years, they show a Trump lead, and then the Cook poll had Trump up by 2. Now, the good news for Harris is that she's up in the Wall Street Journal poll by 2. That's definitely good for her. So I think you can make a very good case for Harris in Georgia. And if there was such a thing as betting for the over and the under, I think consensus that Trump's going to win Georgia by 3, I'd definitely take the under on that. But I do still view him as the favorite, depending on what happens with early voting. So more on, really more on Georgia in the future. Pennsylvania, I could kind of do more with because we actually have tangible data there. Now, I am going to put Arizona in the tilt Republican column for now, and Democrats just had really bad polling there as of late. And I don't know why, to be honest. It's kind of surprising because, obviously, those of you've been watching the channel, know that I was pretty confident Harris is going to win Arizona, but CH has not been doing well in the polling here. And again, if I talked about the Pennsylvania poll from New York Times, it's a good reason to, favor Harris in Pennsylvania. Of course, I'm going to talk about the New York Times poll that had Trump up even more in Arizona in their likely voter screen. Let's see. They push undecided. They have Trump up by 5%, 51 to 46. He's past the 50% threshold. That is bad for Harris. I mean, this is a very high-quality pollster that actually had her up in the summer by 5 points. They've since seen a 10-point shift towards Donald Trump. Now, I don't think that Harris is actually going to do 10 points worse than she would have done in the summer, but that shift, even if it's wrong on magnitude, could directionally be correct in a state like Arizona. This matters. And I also think that, obviously the Republicans have been on kind of a losing streak here as of late. Obviously, Martha M. lost a Senate race, then Blake Masters lost a Senate race, and then we had Kay Lake lose the governorship, and then we had Republicans losing the Secretary of State election because they ran a very right-wing candidate who didn't accept the results of the 2020 election, which didn't sit well with voters, right? But obviously, Donald Trump has, I think, done himself some harm with the 2020 election denial, and I think it's that he would be winning this election by more, or if he does win. The point is, I think he'd be doing better now by a good amount if he hadn't, tried to, if he hadn't, made claims with the 2020 election. But also, he's polling better than any of those 4 GOP candidates did in terms of extremism. I think American voters have kind of been, normalized to it, so they're more open to voting for Trump than they are to other Republicans who share his beliefs with the 2020 election. And so that is why I think it might not make sense in my head, because if someone finds that the election stuff is disqualifying for Kari Lake or for Blake Masters, but you'd expect them to do the same for Trump, that's not the case, which is why Trump leads in the polls. And by the way, Kari Lake is losing that Senate race by 7 or 8 points in the polling data at the same time. So clearly there's a lot of voters in Arizona who do like Trump but don't like Kari Lake, right? But the thing here that I really keep coming back to is that unless the polls like really tighten up here, it's going to be hard to make a case for Harris before election day. This might be like my upset take because I usually like to pick an upset. So Arizona is my favorite state for the upset, maybe Georgia, but for now I'm going to put Trump ahead there. So now Nevada and Wisconsin just genuinely have like such conflicting opinions on just start with Nevada, right? Like the polling has been pretty good for Harris. And this is a state where the polls have actually underestimated Democrats in the past. Emerson had Harris up by 1, RMG had them tied, and then let's see, you have a lot of GOP internal polls here that I'm kind of not talking about. GSG had Harris up by 1, Tip Insights had her up by 4, but I'm not a big fan of them. I think they're a bit overrated. So I don't know, the polls are all pretty close. I'm going to give it to Trump just for now, solely because I do believe that the demographics of the state are better for him than people think, right? You have, like, this is what it is. Clark County, that's where 3/4 of the votes come from. And this, like, the same routine that I do every time I talk with Nevada. And those of you who've been watching the channel, I apologize because I'm just sounding like a broken record. Clark County, that's where 3/4 of the votes come from. You have a lot of working class voters who, work in Las Vegas. They work service jobs often. You have a lot of voters, right? Like Hispanic voters, black voters, Asian voters who don't have college degrees. That demographic swung towards Trump in 2020. It's why he did a 1.5 better in Clark County than the previous time. And so when you consider that, it's easy to see why that could swing again towards him. And again, it's kind of like Democrats. If they fall another 2 points in Clark County, it's going to be hard for them to win Nevada because this is the state or this is the county where 75% of the votes come from, and Democrats really rely on winning it. I do think Harris is going to do well in Washoe County, but again, compared to Clark, that's like, 1/17 of the voting population. So to me, it's kind of a wash there. I do think that, no pun intended, I do think this is going to be one of the, I think by raw votes, certainly the closest state because Nevada is small, and it's also very competitive, right? I think for now I'm going to pick Trump, but I totally could reverse this on election day if the polls have been getting better for Harris there. And by the way, I will do more math on these states before election day, so I can have like a very concrete example, because on election day or on the day before the election, when I post my video, I'm going to show you the margins in all the swing states, and I'm going to tell you why they're going to happen. But for now, Nevada, super unconfident, defer to Trump because I think he has the advantage on demographics. Now, Wisconsin. This is the final one, and this is just like so close. For now, I'm going to pick Kamala Harris to win it. Now, I say this with, I think, like a similar amount of confidence to my Nevada prediction, just because it's so close. But again, Kamala Harris up by a point, and this is, I think, a little skewed by the fact that the GOP has really been dumping a lot of internal polling that's helping them, right? Insider Advantage, Trafalgar Group, again, or actually this is nonpartisan, sorry, but these two of the last 3 polls have been GOP commissioned, and then we had this one obviously commissioned by Donald Trump himself. So that's really 3. And then the nonpartisan polls have been better for Harris. She's up by 1 in Wall Street Journal. She's down by 2 in Quinnipiac, which is a concern. But she's up in Redfield and Wilton. In Emerson, she's only down by 1. GSG, she's up by 2. And then in New York Times, Siena, which is, I think, the most compelling factor here, she's up by 2. So it's a very close race. And Wisconsin, as a state, actually, in presidential elections, has really been close every year since 2000, with the exception of the 2 times Obama ran. But it was close when Al Gore won. It was close when John Kerry won it. And it was close when both times Trump was on the ballot. First time he won it, second time he lost. So what does this all mean? The reason that I'm going to give it to Harris as of right now is simple. I believe Democrats are going to do just enough in Dane County, which is where Madison is, to win the state. You talk about Democrats, why they've been on a winning streak in Wisconsin as of late, it's because they're able to energize their voters in Dane County when all else fails. Tony Evers in 2022, he won that race because Madison came out to vote, and Mandela Barnes could have lost by 4 or 5. Democrats, left him out to dry in the final month of that campaign. He almost won just because of Dane County, right? Kamala Harris, I think, is the right type of candidate to do well here. This county has been coming out for Democrats. It's not like it's progressive, but I don't think it's like ideologically progressive in the sense that they won't come out for Democrats who aren't progressive. I think Harris is progressive enough, especially relative to Biden in the eyes of the average voter. And of course, the really big thing here is the Democrats have, I think, a pretty rigorous like get out the vote operation, which to me is important in a state like Wisconsin, especially because you have so many like Democrats who, especially, right, like in real Wisconsin, who, who are going to come out to vote, but maybe don't like mobilize, like, excuse me, like they don't mobilize in the sense that you don't see a lot of enthusiasm because they might live in a red area. They might not bring like a friend or two to the polls, right? Like that matters in swing states. And that's why a lot of like a lot of diehard Democrats, diehard Republicans in competitive states will bring friends to the polls to vote, right? And I think those little things matter. And I trust the Wisconsin Dems more than I do the Wisconsin GOP because they've actually been able to do it more effectively in the past 6-8 years. Again, Republicans won the 2022 Senate race here, I think, because Democrats left Mandela Barnes out to dry. Democrats could have easily won this race had they actually funded Barnes in the final months. Democrats won all the majority of the other races, and then, obviously, in 2020, Biden won the state, and Democrats have been doing well there in off-year elections, which doesn't matter as much, but it's still important. So that's why I defer to Harris to win here. It's going to be incredibly close. In this electoral map, 270 for Harris, so she literally wins by like one electoral vote. 268 for Trump. So this is going to be a very close election, as I think I've made clear many times throughout this video. And I genuinely do believe that we're going to see what will likely be a very divisive result if it is this close, which I hope doesn't happen. But again, that's where I am right now. So this is the second to last of these predictions. You'll see me once again, or actually you'll see me many times before Election Day. But this is the second to last official presidential election prediction. So let me know what you think. Let me know who you expect to win, and I'll see you all tomorrow.